Janet held up the cover to Someday I'll Find You is in a way the book I was always meant to write, I think, and was kind of working up to, writing all these other books almost as training, to get to tell. And I should be clear here, it's not my parents' story. It's my parents' ethos, really. I wanted to tackle something that dealt with a world where kids, effectively, 20-year-olds, have to make a choice whether they're going to run away or whether they're going to stand up and fight. And both my parents made that latter choice. My dad joined the RAF actually 6 months before the war broke out because he knew it was coming. And as he said to me, I was buggered if I was going to get shot in a trench. He had, he was an actor and he knew where the good uniforms were, right? So the RAF, and he became a fighter pilot, Battle of Britain pilot, North African pilot, got shot down in North Africa. If I have time, I'll show you his logbook, which I have out there, which is one of my favorite pieces of research. And my mum had a different story. So I'll tell you a bit about her background first, and then we can go from there. And I think we're saving questions for the end, aren't we, Bill? Is that the plan? Give me the thumbs up if that's true. Yeah. Coffee, very important. So, Ingegerd Holter, formerly of Bestum, which I've discovered is close to where Jürgen grew up, and he went to the same high school or preparatory school, perhaps, as my mother in Bestum. It's basically a suburb of Oslo, and she was born into this family of actors. Not something you'd wish on a lot of people, especially when you have a father who's as I suppose narcissistic would be the modern term, as my grandfather Carl was, very self-obsessed about himself and his career. And so he led them a merry dance, the children. He had 4 kids. My mum was the eldest legitimate child. My grandfather was, he lived to all the cliches of being an artist and a writer and an actor by fathering illegitimate children as well as legitimate, many of whom have popped into our life quite recently. And in fact, for you Norwegian fans, I'm going to a family reunion of all us Holters, all descended from these 4 men born around the 1880s, and all the children, and well, there's one child alive from that people's generation, and she was the youngest of the 3rd marriage of my grandfather's younger brother. So she's kind of my mother's generation still. She's only 82. Elizabeth, she's organizing it, and we're going out to the family farm, which is at a place called Vam, which is not far from Oslo. And we had that farm since 1565. And I think one of my grandparents had to sell it because of tax reasons to the Norwegian government. They turned it into a farm museum, and we're allowed to go back and take it over once in a while if we ask nicely. So that's where we're going to meet 100 Holters, all these descendants. So that's going to be fun. That's in August. But yes, so my mum grew up in Oslo. She was very beautiful. And in fact, I'm going to just flick up a picture of her at one early thing that happened to her in 1936, when she was 22 years old. She became, dun dun dun, here you are, Oslo Princess. Can you all see that? Yeah. Janet, give me the thumbs up. I can just see you in the corner there. Yeah. So you can see that Oslo Princess. I talk about it being Miss Oslo, but it's because that's an easier shorthand for it. It's not quite, but she was in many ways the embodiment of Norway. She was beautiful. You can start to see that there. You'll see that more later. She was from a family of oh, sorry, I want to get rid of that one. She was from a family of artists. She was a well-known family, Carl Holter's family. And yes, that was Mum in 1936. There she is on the float with the also-rans, I presume, the maidens, and so that was a big moment for. Oh, hang on a second, I need to stop the share, don't I? There we go. that was a big moment for my mother. Um, my mother was like all the Holter Humphries. I've inherited and I read recently that there is actually a nomad gene. And I'm sure it's connected with Vikings, because obviously they were the big wanderers. I am a wanderer, just described being in the Balkans. That's one of many trips I've taken in my life. My mum, unusually then for a younger woman, she was very restless. And in 1936, soon after being the princess, boarded a ship with her younger sister, cruised around South America, ended up in New York, and hopped ship. And my mum was an illegal immigrant in America for a couple of years. She lived at the Young Women's Christian Association hostel in downtown Manhattan, and worked at the Norwegian legation or the consulate in Manhattan. Her younger sister, Tante Jørgen, she was a nanny, and then they both moved to Washington, where she worked in the Norwegian embassy. So she worked in the Norwegian embassy in Washington, and then in '38, she was going to stay on as she was applying to be a citizen. But her younger sister was going back to Norway, and at the last moment she decided to go with her and went back to Norway. And then, of course, it's always that thing when you go home after you really want to be away and you're back for 2 weeks having a good time, and then you think, oh no, I'm back here again. And so she decided to abscond again. By this time, she was working for a man called Gabriel Smith. And Gabriel Smith, that English sounding name, was actually Norwegian, and he was in a company called, he and his brother had founded a company called the Bell Shipping Company. And my mum was a very gifted personal assistant, typist, secretary, did all that. And she was his personal assistant, but still quite, she still had the travel bug. So after a while, she said, look, I just want to go off again. And he said, well, don't leave me. I'll send you to the London offices. So in '39, she was sent off to London, where she worked for Bell Ships in London for in the London branch. And it was in London where she was in 1939, September the 3rd, when Chamberlain made his famous speech. And she would have been sitting in one part of London listening to it on the radio. And my father, who was a young actor at the time, but had spent 6 months training to be a pilot, would have heard Chamberlain announce, we are at war with Germany. My mum decided to go back. I mean, London immediately didn't look like the most hospitable place to be. The sandbags were up, the anti-aircraft guns were out, and her country was neutral. So head back to Norway, which she did. And as we all know from the history, April the 9th, Hitler did not respect Norway's neutrality and invaded. My mum was in Oslo. She talked about how the first she actually knew about it, because any fighting in Oslo had taken place, outside. You probably know that the Norwegian commander at Oscarburg Fortress sunk the Blucher, it was sailing up the fjord. But the first my mum knew about it was looking out her office window in downtown Oslo and seeing a swastika run up at Akersburg, which is the fort in Oslo. Her boss, Gabrielle, immediately said, this shall not pass. I'm going to work with the resistance group or form a resistance group. Are you in? And she said, absolutely, I'm in. And so she immediately began working for the fragmented Norwegian resistance. What's interesting, and my brother, who's done a lot of research, and he's the one who's put up all those things on the ancestry, which I'm calling up periodically. We think in our research, and the research I did, for my novel, that Mum was actually, or Gabrielle was, and therefore Mum was actually working for SOE, the Special Operations Executive, which I'm sure many of you know about, was what Churchill set up to, as he put it, set Europe ablaze. It was the spies, and it was sort of made up of some sort of oddball people, but they were the ones who were parachuted in. They were the ones who worked with the local groups, did the sabotage, did the assassinations, all that. The reason we think she was probably with them is it was, this will be later in the story, but the speed with which she was got out of Norway when it all went wrong. There's a couple of stories in Norway of what happened with her work. Essentially, she was quite important. She was a liaison because, as you know, it was they operated on cells in order to minimize the damage when one cell went down, which they did with extraordinary regularity. As I say in the book, when my character Ilsa is being interviewed by SOE to see if she'll be suitable, and they're telling her about the situation in Norway now, the country under occupation by then, and one of the officers says, your countrymen talk too much, and she says, you got to forgive us. We're just not. We haven't had a war in 150 years. Where it's going to take us time to catch up. So Mum's job was really to act as a bit of a liaison between cells. She also would be a courier for mainly, I believe, and I have to tell you, most of this information was not got from my mother. It's surmised. She told us a bit towards the end of her life, but there were a couple of things. One was she was a spy, right? They don't readily reveal secrets. Two, she would have signed the Official Secrets Act, which, if my mother made a commitment to something, she stuck to it. But we did ascertain that she would run information between different groups. So there was one cell that was tasked with keeping an eye on German shipping movements in the Oslo fjord, for example. What munitions were coming in, what was going out, the submarine pens that were built fairly locally, things like that. And that information would be gathered by one cell, and then it would be encoded. Actually, probably wasn't encoded. Well, it would have been encoded in some way, and then she would carry it on paper. And I read later in my research into SOE that the British designed these wonderful secret compartment bras, which she'd carry the secrets in her bra. And I go back to Miss Oslo, of course. I mean, my mum, of course, Miss Oslo was Aryan beauty personified. The Germans loved her. The Germans thought she was great and were very polite to her. And I mean, obviously, some of them flirted with her and all that. But generally, they thought, oh, this is Norway. This is the Northern European folk that we're fighting for. So she would run this up to she'd meet a red-bearded man at a ruined church on the outside of Oslo, and didn't know his name. Would give him that. He would take it to the radio operators, who were moving around all the time, of course, and they would further encode and send it off to England. So that was her job. Now, just backtracking a bit, she did that job for a year, and I'll talk about what happened in a second. But part of the background of that also was that when Norway was invaded, as you know, they fought for 2 months. Oslo was taken like that, but they fought for 2 months in the valleys and up in the north, particularly around Narvik and all that. Her younger brother, Tord, was another wandering Holter. He'd gone off, joined a whaling fleet when he was 16, traveled all over the world, hop ship in Argentina, became a gaucho because he was a horseman. When he came back to Europe, the Russians invaded Finland. He joined the Norwegian volunteers, went and fought the Russians in Finland, was on his way back with the horses because he was the horse guy. When the Germans invaded, immediately put on a Norwegian uniform and almost immediately was badly wounded in a fight with the Germans up on the Swedish-Norwegian border. And he was in a hospital in a converted factory up there. And my mother and her younger sister, Tante Jorunn, went up to see him and to try to help. And they were immediately recruited by the doctors who were looking after German soldiers, Norwegian soldiers, and there were German doctors and Norwegian doctors just working together to look after these boys. And so he'd been shot in the shoulder, but he was all right. It was a bit touch and go, but he was all right. He healed. Her father came, Carl, the controversial one, more controversial he'll become. And then, so that was the first time she'd seen him in a while, because he was living in the countryside by then. The doctors said to them, look, we were thinking of going to try to join the Norwegian forces up near Narvik, but it looks like it's all going to be over soon. So we're going to hop across the border to Sweden, and work for the Norwegians there and try to get to England. So they asked them to go, the two sisters to go. Mum's younger sister, Tante Joran, went with them. My mother pleaded that she couldn't go. She had work to do in Oslo. She had a boyfriend. My mother did have a boyfriend. She liked boyfriends she had a lot of boyfriends in the cavalry for some reason. She enjoyed the cavalry officers. But the real reason, of course, she couldn't go was she was a spy in Oslo. So she went back to Oslo and continued with her work. Now, here's where the controversial stuff arises. And this is something I depict in the book. This is something that's very closely related to my family. Her father, Carl, was half German, had won many writing awards in Germany. He'd gone to Berlin in 1936 because he'd won this award for a play called Ice Folk, which depicted hardy Northern Europeans. It was very popular in Germany, and shaken Goering's hand while he was there. Carl, as he said, he signed up with the Norwegians to fight the invaders. So where was I? Oh yeah, so Carl, as I say, he claimed to be fighting, but he didn't actually do any fighting. And then, of course, he joined the Norwegian Nazi Party, Quisling's party. And, and I'm not going to make any sort of excuses for him, his daughters, all his family, and us still believe. But what I also am interested in is the ambiguity of war. Many people made many choices based on things that happened then that we struggle now to see, and so I do write about what might drive someone like Carl, who was very educated, and as far as we know, it wasn't about anti-Semitism. It was about Northern Europeans. He was a great student of history and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, it sounds like I'm making excuses, but I'm not really. He made his choices, and my mum hadn't seen him for many months, and he suddenly shows up in Oslo. This is probably in maybe May or June of 1940, and so the maybe slightly later, because the war was over, and Mum was at her office in Oslo in the harbour there, and Carl suddenly shows up, and he's come from the countryside, and he arrives in her office, and he puts down a grease-proof paper wrapped package, and she says, "What's that?" And he says, "It's butter. I brought you butter from the farm." Now, they hadn't seen butter in Oslo since April the 9th. And she looked at him and she said, "Is it true, Father, that you've joined the Nazi Party?" And he said, "Well, yes, because, and he started to talk about it, and she just shoved the package back at him and said, 'Take your butter back, Father,' which were the last words she spoke to him for 7 years. Kicked him out of the office. Carl is another story. I go into it a bit in my book, in that the character of Wilhelm, Ilse's father in the book, is like Carl, a propagandist. He's a writer. He writes basically propaganda for the Nazi Norwegians, writing in the newspapers, articles favoring the Germans. He also, Carl, not my character in the book, was what they would call, they didn't call it that then, but he was embedded with the Norwegian Legion at the siege of Leningrad. So he was up there in uniform, writing reports about our brave lads fighting the Bolsheviks, because to many Norwegians, that's what it was about: Bolshevism, fighting the, ancient enmities, fighting the Slav, right?